Greetings, nerdlings! Today, we're going to be discussing natural selection, a major mechanism of evolution. Before we get started on evolution, let's talk about the father of evolution, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin loved nature, and he actually studied to be a clergyman, which is kind of counterproductive since he came up with the theory of evolution, which was not so popular at his time. He went on the HMS Beagle for a voyage around the world. This is where he made all of his observations. So Charles Darwin is credited with proposing the mechanism for evolution as natural selection. He spent 5 years sailing around the world, and he spent most of his time in South America and its neighboring islands. He published his theory of evolution in the book called On the Origin of Species, overcoming scientific rejection of earlier concepts of transmutation of species. Again, like I said, the theory of evolution was pretty frowned upon in his time. So Darwin hypothesized that all life descended from a common ancestor. This is actually one of the pages from his book. He says, "I think," and then he drew this tree, basically stating that everything evolved from a common ancestor right here. Charles Darwin established that all species of life have descended over time from common ancestors, and he proposed the scientific theory that this branching pattern of evolution resulted from a process that he called natural selection, in which the struggle for existence has a similar effect to the artificial selection involved in selective breeding, similar to what we do with corn or our pets like dogs. You think that tiny little teacup chihuahua got there by itself? Nope. Artificial breeding. So just what is evolution? It's the change in a population's genetic makeup over time. So for example, this owl might have had a mutation that caused its feathers to turn brown. That might have been a favorable adaptation because maybe it helped to camouflage it better so it could sneak up on its prey. According to Darwin's theory of natural selection, competition for limited resources results in differential survival, meaning, for example, the lion that is the most fit and can attack its prey or defend its prey from other predators, that's the one who's going to survive and be able to reproduce, and her offspring will be left to reproduce. So eventually her genes will go from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. Individuals with the more favorable phenotypes are more likely to survive and to produce offspring, thus passing on their traits to the future generations. Like this attractive crab man. He passed on his huge crab claw to the future generations. Natural selection. This was what Darwin proposed as the mechanism of evolution. A population can change over time if the individuals with more fit traits are left or they leave their more offspring, and their offspring that are less fit individuals do not survive. So the offspring that have more favorable traits are the ones that are going to survive and be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. Individuals that don't have those favorable traits, they're not going to be able to reproduce, so their genes aren't going to get passed on to the next generation. So here's a graphic representation. Say we have an individual that has some type of light gray coloration. Reproduction occurs and a mutation creates variation. Instead of only having this light gray color, we now have white, light gray, and we have this dark gray color. Eventually, the unfavorable mutations are selected against. Maybe they can't reproduce because they got eaten. So maybe the white ones stand out. But nonetheless, they aren't allowed to reproduce, so they die off. They no longer are part of the gene pool because their genes didn't get passed on to that future generation. So now we only have the light gray and the dark gray left over. Another generation goes by, they reproduce, and again, favorable mutations are more likely to survive. So the light gray ones now start getting eaten, which leaves only the dark gray ones left behind. Another example would be these blackbirds and the green and the orange beetles. So generation 1, For example, if we have green and orange beetles, and those blackbirds love those green beetles, they're going to eat all of those green beetles. The next generation, you're going to see less green beetles being able to reproduce because they got eaten. The orange beetles are going to reproduce, and you'll see in the next generation that we have more orange beetles. Eventually, all of the green beetles are going to get eaten, and they're no longer going to be contributing their genes to the gene pool, which leaves only the orange beetles to survive. Darwin also observed adaptations of plants and animals, and he saw fossils in South America. Once he started looking at the fossils, he noticed that a lot of the fossils look similar to the organisms of today. So he began to consider that fossils belong to the ancestors of modern species that were walking or flying today. In the Galapagos Islands, Darwin saw animals that were very similar to the mainland, but slightly different on each island. The two largest examples would be the tortoise's shells and the beaks of the finches. So all of the tortoise's shells are slightly different from the mainland, each of them adapted for the specific environment of the island that they're on. Same thing with the finches. We have an ancestral finch population on the main island, but as those finches radiated out to the other islands, their beaks adapted to their new environment and to their new food sources. So we have finches whose beaks adapted to eating mainly insects, those that were mainly adapted to eating seeds. We have very specialized beak like this one right here, the cactus finch. It has a much longer beak because it doesn't want to get pricked by all the spines of the cactus, and this allows it to go in between the parts of the cactus. And then we have specialized beak for eating buds and fruits. Darwin inferred that adaptation to the environment and origin of new species are related. So basically, new species were forming as they were adapting to their different environments. And he started thinking. He called this descent with modification. Descent meaning descended from that common ancestor, but with a modification. In this sense, the finches modified their beaks to eat the food source that was available on the island that they had gone to. So Darwin came up with different observations. He observed that populations change over time as evidence of the fossil record. There are always more offspring produced than the preceding generation. He also said that populations, if left unchecked, will grow exponentially. Now, Darwin used elephants to illustrate the points above. He estimated that if elephants underwent unrestricted reproduction, that in 740 to 750 years, there would be about 19 million elephants produced from just that one original pair. Now, obviously, Darwin's theory on that was a little bit flawed. He wasn't taking into consideration the death rate, any types of diseases that might occur. He wasn't taking into consideration a 50-50 split of females and males. So all of those things kind of contribute to the flaw in his observation. Now, this is a graph representing exponential growth. So he was predicting that the elephants would grow exponentially along this line. We have our logistic model, and then what was actually observed. So Darwin's elephant problem. There was no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increased at so high a rate that if not destroyed, the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair. The elephant is reckoned to be the slowest breeder of all known animals, and I have taken some pains to estimate its probable minimum growth of natural increase. It will be under the mark to assume that it breeds when 30 years old and goes on breeding till 90 years old, bringing forth 3 pairs of young in this interval. If this be so, at the end of the 5th century, there would be alive 15 million elephants descended from the first pair. This excerpt was taken from one of Darwin's pages. So Darwin observed that resources are limited. So like we discussed a little bit earlier, organisms are constantly competing for food, for mates, for space. And those resources that are limited mean that survival of the fittest takes place. there's going to be competition for those resources. He also observed that variation is heritable, meaning that all of these different variations are inherited from the parents. This is why sexual reproduction occurs. We want variations in the traits. We want diversity. So Darwin's observations, he observed that there is a variation within a given species, and the majority of this variation is inherited. So for example, in this litter of kittens right here, we have a large variation of coat coloration. Now, depending on the environment that the kittens are placed in, that's going to depend on what kittens are left to survive and reproduce. So for example, if these kittens were in an area where they hunted at night on a busy road, the black kittens were probably going to get hit by a car sooner or later. So those kittens might die off, leaving the ones with the lighter coats, the brown and tan coats, to reproduce. So in that area, you might start seeing an increase in light-colored cats as opposed to dark-colored cats because they were selected against by their environment. Any variation may, to some degree, affect the ability of an organism to reproduce and to contribute its genes to the gene pool, thus affecting the evolutionary success. Some inherited traits are beneficial and contribute to survival. So adaptations in fitness. An adaptation is a genetically controlled trait that is favored by natural selection and gives the organism a reproductive advantage, ensuring the trait is passed on to its descendants. This trait may also allow the individual to survive longer, thus increasing the reproductive rate of the individual. So looking at these two guys right here, we have the antelope hare and the snowshoe hare. The antelope hare has really long ears, a very lean body. This helps it get rid of heat because it's found in the desert. Those long ears help it to expel excess heat. He has legs that are really adapted to running. He has short fur, again, because it has to get rid of excess heat. It's also colored to blend into its environment. Down here, we have our snowshoe hare. This one has much shorter ears because unlike the antelope hare, the snowshoe hare wants to conserve its heat because it lives in a very cold environment. It's much thicker as well. It's going to have a thicker layer of hair. It's also going to have a thicker layer of fat. But just like the hare above, the antelope hare, this one too is adapted for its environment as far as coloration goes. It's white and it's adapted to the snowy environment so it can blend in. Just like the hare up here has a brown-gray coloration that blends into the background. Another very common example that's used is the peppered moth. So back in England, before the Industrial Revolution, we had this white peppered moth and we had a plain black moth. Only 2% of the population was composed of the black moths. Well, after the Industrial Revolution occurred, soot started taking place. So soot started covering the tree trunks. Eventually, the black moths blended into the tree trunks better. So the black moths were the ones that survived because the birds would pick off whatever moth they could see. Before the Industrial Revolution, they could see the black moths very well. After the Industrial Revolution, whenever those trees were covered with soot, they could see the white moths very well. So after that revolution took place, 95% of the moths were black as opposed to 2% before. This is a very classic example of the environment selecting against one coloration versus the next. We're talking about the phenotype, not the genotype. This is pertaining to microevolution, meaning small. So a gene is a sequence of DNA nucleotides that specify a particular polypeptide chain. An allele is a particular form of a gene. So for example, if big B represents the allele for black wing color in those moths, and little b for the white wing color, the selection acts on the phenotype, because in this case, survivorship depends on the phenotype, not the genotype. It depends on whether that moth blends into the environment or whether it doesn't. If it blends into the environment, it has a greater chance of not getting eaten and being able to pass on its genes to future generations. Natural selection acts on individuals, but only populations evolve. So I want you guys to make sure you write this portion down. that natural selection does act on the individual, but only populations evolve. An individual cannot evolve. Populations do. So Darwin made several inferences based on the observations. He inferred that production of more individuals than can be supported by the environment leads to a struggle for existence, with only a fraction of the offspring surviving each generation. He also observed that individuals whose inherited traits confer an advantage have a better chance of surviving in a given environment and will leave more offspring. So the better adapted you are to the environment, the more you're going to be able to reproduce and pass your genes on to future offspring. He also inferred that unequal fitness will lead to gradual change in a population, with favorable traits accumulating over each generation. This will lead to eventually accumulation of enough change to where a new species might occur, evidence in our large cats. So I'm going to leave you with this. Evolutionary fitness is measured by reproductive success. This is the Queen Nerdling signing off. Stay nerdy until next time.